So I've suggested that the terms pride and prejudice represent two contending historical forces. Um, Pride, the force of tradition, um, prejudice, the new modern speed of communication, insatiable consumer desire, um, chatter, of the activity of modern uh, commerce. And I'm suggesting further that Austen's narrative innovation, the experience of reading Austen's novels, um, represents a new experience of time, a new experience of appreciation for history, and the weight of human experience, of the implicit gravity, seriousness, weight, and power, significance of experience, combined with a new um, uh, sharpness and attentiveness to irony, and the this new speed of modern interaction, and reconciliation of this conflict, this historical conflict, um, and a kind of intelligence to recognize that conflict, to decipher it, to read it, but also reading. Jane Austen presents reading as a significant embodied practice in its own right, akin to dancing. Um, and it's contrasted with a number of social behaviors emblematized by a number of different characters in Pride and Prejudice that I'm going to go through now, um, that are presented as uh, mechanically reinforcing the ideology, particularly of patriarchy. Um, and so the uh, so two things I want to mention that might be illuminating of what I'm saying here. One is that Austen herself declined to marry and devoted herself to a life of literature, a very short life, died in her early 40s. Um, and so um, that's illuminating. She declined to marry in order to write marriage novels, novels about marriage. Um, so there's that's just something to think about. There may be something more uh, in Romanticism in general. We're looking at images of failed lives. Um, we're telling stories about failed, absent, hollowed out characters, and thereby creating new kinds of character, new kinds of community of readers. That's a theme, you know, from Wordsworth. You, I don't have a story. You tell me what the story is. You're the active reader. Um, are creating something significant through the experience of reading. Something socially significant is at stake in the experience of literature. So that's what I want to emphasize in Austen's, her, you know, biographical representation, embodiment of a literary life, um, and that might represent something new and new kind of personhood, new kind of society is made available through the pastime itself of literature, and again how that's aligned with the how that ennobles the traditionally disparaged and neglected female domestic scene. Um, the other thing I want to just highlight is the um, or persuasion begins with the discussion of the baronetcy, which is this book that of ancestry that just delineates the various nobility in excruciating detail. Um, and the shallowness of a particular character, the patriarch, in Persuasion, is indicated by his obsession with rereading this book. Um, and that is sort of the opposite, or I think that mechanical repetition of a kind of uh, static story is reading a Jane Austen novel. Um, that isn't just a repetition, but a kind of life, growth, um, with the daffodils. Um, that's important. So characters in Pride and Prejudice fall prey to or are denatured, lose personhood, that fall prey to the conflict of between Pride and Prejudice in various ways. There's that one character, sorry, I'm blanking on the name, who's always falling asleep. He's great in the BBC version. He's like, people are having conversations, the plot is going on around him, and he's always like dozing off in the background. It's a perfect spoof on aristocratic sluggishness, you know, that, or pride. He has so much pride. He's basically inert. He doesn't need. He's so complacent, self-complacent, that he's asleep. So that and it, you know, Darcy's pride is it has less extreme. Well, it has its own problems. Um, so, but I want to look through number of examples of you know, the failings of the way in which people fail to read in the way that Austen's novel is kind of teaching us to read these complexities of social reality. Um, so, in these examples, I think you find, like I mentioned before, oddball couplings. Like, you might be surprised to see Collins and Darcy both, you know, exploiting that patriarchal book, that rule book of patriarchy. You're surprised to see them aligned in any way, and you might be surprised to see Mr. and Mrs. Bennet aligned in a kind of denial, avoidance of the reality of their situation. Um, so it's funny because Mr. Ben is so sharp, and he is like Elizabeth in his ironic awareness of all the of social reality that Mrs. Bennet is totally um, So that's a interesting, again, complex characterization that Austen's giving us. We think these characters are opposites, but underlying that apparent opposition uh, is a common ground. And that's sort of what I want to say about Pride and Prejudice in general. Is she's uh, showing us a reconciliation, and well, or synthesis, not resolution, but the the key term I'm emphasizing in Austen and Romanticism in general is the form of irony, which is a form of tension, unresolved tension, and that's related to the activity of reading, and related again to dance, to music. We There's a rhythm to it. It's not resolved, um, still, but it's open ended and challenging to the reader. It makes the reader has to be active, just as we have to actively engage in as we experience a piece of music or participate in a dance. This passage here from chapter 13, we see Mr. Bennet acknowledging reality, the stark circumstances that the premise of the drama. This is the truth. Mr. Collins, when I'm dead, may turn you all out of this house as soon as he pleases. But he makes a joke out of it, which is a kind of denial. It's like, dude, that's actually not funny. And the question of reading is raised here in a subtle way too, um, in a relation to Mrs. Bennet. Um, so she and I mean she's right here. Like she's saying, don't talk about that. I mean, I think she's right. Not to say don't talk about it, but don't talk about it in this dismissive um, uh, way. I do think it is the hardest thing in the world. That's, I mean, in a way, I love how Austen sneaks in these statements that are actually quite penetrating and profound, in the mouth of the last person you'd expect to say anything insightful. Um, so, um, now this is interesting, this paragraph here. Um, Jane and Elizabeth tried to explain to her the nature of an entail. It's as if they're explaining it to the reader of the novel, because I mean Austen had withheld that piece of that circumstance of their situation, and in order to maybe d- uh, draw the reader into a lighter seeming romantic narrative. Um, not so hard, an easier story. And now they're explaining it to her, but they're also sort of asking the reader, "Do you understand?" Um, they'd often attempted to do it before, like we've mentioned the entail, but do you get the point, reader? Um, It was a subject on which Miss Bennet was beyond the reach of reason, and she continued to rail bitterly against the cruelty of settling in state away from a family of 5 daughters in favor of a man whom nobody cared anything about. That's great. It's like she's saying Mr. in favor of a man nobody cared any about. Like that's what's happening in this novel. Like you don't like Mr. Collins, but he's the one who's gonna inherit it all. So she's I love here how she's putting aligning the reader with, or asking the reader implicitly if you're going to stay in the kind of fantasy land of denial that Miss Bennet is in, even as we think we're so much smarter than she is. Second example, Miss Bingley, she is a figure of, you know, envy. She envies Lizzie because Darcy pays attention more attention to her, and so she leverages patriarchal power to punish the Bennets and Jane in particular. And what so I think what's important about the idea of resentment is it's self-destructive, even as it's, you know, she's trying to hurt Jane, but she's also not doing herself any favors. She's leveraging, you know, male privilege to hurt uh, another woman, but she's, you know, not also hurting, undermining her own position as a woman. Um, and what I like about this is the power of the letter, and the way that's underscored again, the power of the book. She's just asserting my ability to cause pain through writing, the power of dogmatic language, just the privilege entitlement that is exercised through language. In this case, writing a letter, and I like how Jane so perceptively identifies it in grammatical terms. Is this sentence that sentence says a lot. She recognizes the power of the this piece of grammar itself. My third example, Charlotte, is more complex. You know, these aren't schematic. You know, I do think that Mr. Bennet is a, you know, more complex character than Mrs. Bennet. Um, but and I think Charlotte is interesting. I mean, psychologically interesting as a non-romantic. She's very. I I think there's something compelling about her. Um, uh, Austen gives her anti-romanticism a legitimacy. She's just kind of saying, "I'm not into it. Doesn't matter. Like I'm approaching marriage as the economic institution that it is, in realistic terms." But and in the BBC version, I'm really fond of that performance. She gives that attitude of dignity and poise that is compelling. Um, the but it's troubling too, and Elizabeth's reaction to it is. I mean, it's important. It shines a light. It's such a humiliating picture. There's something deeply degrading. Marriage is not just an economic institution. It's a social and intimate relationship, um, and it Elizabeth's reaction to it is very strong. I mean, she felt persuaded that no real confidence could ever subsist between them again. That's a interesting thing to think about. Would you to have a reaction like that, um, to somebody's relationship with somebody else? Um, th- like, is could you go over that far? Like, if somebody has made a choice in their relationship with somebody else, a friend of yours made a relate entered into a intimate relationship, a significant relationship with somebody else that you didn't agree with or you found humiliating, would that fundamentally change your relationship with that person? Um, that's an interesting question that is a novelistic question because it has to do with the way in which we are. Other complicating features here. Charlotte makes a very. She is wise, and it makes a very insightful observation about Elizabeth, which is she doesn't make allowance enough for differences of situation and temper. That is a key problem of Elizabeth's prejudice. Um, she is overlooking complexities, and so that um, tempers these are both valid insights, and so the complexity of Austen's narrative. I thought this is a very interesting line, um, and it raises an interesting question, and recalls, how can you choose not to hear? Are you This reminds me of the narration of Darcy's um, supposed resistance of Elizabeth's charms. He's said he's wise to evolved to isolate himself from Elizabeth when he starts to feel attracted to her, and so I think we get a bit of free and direct discourse channeling Darcy's self-talk, telling himself, trying that he's being wise, and isolating himself precisely because he's in doubt about that. Um, uh, he's trying to reassure himself that he's being wise. Um, and so this similarly is a really complex piece of narration here. It's both it's Elizabeth thinking about what it's like to be Charlotte, getting inside Charlotte's head. So it's the narrator reporting on what Elizabeth is thinking about Charlotte, what Charlotte's thinking about Mr. Collins, what what the rest of the society is thinking about Mr. Collins. Um, this is novelistic intelligence, thinking about these various, multiple degrees of separation. Um, um, that I'm thinking, so Charlotte's thinking about, or Elizabeth's, the narrator thinking about Elizabeth, thinking about Charlotte, thinking about Mr. Collins. Um, this is that uh, networking of identity that I mentioned earlier. That novelistic reading, these ironies in these interplay of perspectives that Austen's novels are giving us exercise in. That's the intelligence the complexity of perspective that she's training, reading Austen is training us in reading this complex social reality. Um, so, who's judging the wisdom here? When Mr. Collins said anything of which his wife might reasonably be ashamed, which certainly was not seldom, she involuntarily turned her eye on Charlotte. So Elizabeth involuntarily turned her eye on Charlotte. So, like, how does she react to that? Um, Once or twice she could discern a faint blush, but in general Charlotte wisely did not hear. It's almost like Elizabeth is hoping that Charlotte's being wise. Um, uh, but not. There's a contradiction here. Like, you don't ch- choose not to hear. You either hear or you don't. You don't exercise judgment about what you hear, right? You might exercise judgment what you listen to, what you pay attention to. There's something. There's a tension in the very uh, wording here that exempt demonstrates this ambivalence, um, is of Charlotte's predicament, of ambivalence of Charlotte's predicament, and ambivalence that Elizabeth's feeling. That's what's getting communicated, is the ambivalence, um, rather than any stable judgment. That's it, the tension, the dynamism of irony, and the complexity, the dance of a particular social predicament. Dance involved in negotiating a particular social predicament that Austen is involving us in, putting us through those paces of this specific scenario. Another kind of failure of reading is exemplified, ironically, by the most literary, textual, in an academic sense, characters, Collins and Mary, the most bookish, um, uh, um, emphatically bookish characters, um, are bad readers, um, in their dogmatism, their adherence to the letter of the text. Um, the you know, Mary at the beginning gives us that dictionary definition of pride, and in a way that is obviously meant to demonstrate how little that tells us. The dictionary definition of words um, explains so little of the social reality. Um, Hence the importance of literature, of stories, to work through the actual dance of the complexity of the social dance. Um, and this, it's funny at first when Mary has that all too literal, offers that all too literal definition of what pride means, but at the end it's terrifying, it's horrifying. Um, Her literalism and its cor- cor- correlation with Collins's literalism. Um, that he, you know, his moralistic view on the fallen woman is like, you're no longer a person, you're no longer a member of the family, and to console yourself as much as possible and throw off your unworthy child from your affection forever and leave her to reap the fruits of her own heinous offense. Uh, that's um, violent. The you know is the violence of uh, language that we saw him exercise in his proposal to Elizabeth. Um, and Elizabeth here is likewise shocked by Mary. Um, Mary's putting into encapsulating, formulating a clear moral from Lydia's um, experience, seduction by the uh, the danger that she falls into, that of questionable reading is Wickham. Um, there's a lot of talk in Pride and Prejudice about the romance of uniforms, but I think an interesting um, way to look at this is also in the inverse way, as in terms of the uniformity of romance, or romance reduced to uniform formula. Um, the Because the character of Wickham, again, who evokes flame, um, is he's seductive to a wide array of characters. He's uniformly seductive, um, and the this there's a paradox in the correlation of the romance of his mysterious, his romantic mystery, and his uniform, regimented, uh, and anonymity. He's like the mysterious individual. His romance, the romance of his individuality, and his anonymity, his regimented anonymity, uniformity, at the same time. So Austen's sort of making us think about the formula, the uniformity of the romantic hero, of romantic individuality. Again, she's so sharp. Um, so this scene of Wickham's introduction ends with it could mean. Um, Interesting question of the premise on which her own, romantic narrative is based, and again, circumspection about the appeal of romance, and again, the illegitimacy of pragmatism such as Charlotte's. So all these examples variously demonstrate again the importance of irony, of reading between the lines, not reading according to predictable, mechanically predictable formula. And this ironic reading is the reading of complexity, is again correlated with dancing. Both are Lady Catherine as well. There's something, she's an aristocrat, but she's too explicit about her claims to aristocratic prestige. This explicitness is both Edmund Burke's the point of Edmund Burke's text, the point that Edmund Burke makes, but also I've suggested maybe the problem of with inherent in Edmund Burke's text is that you can't come out and say um, that aristocracy. You can't explicitly say that aristocracy is prestigious. The saying of it undermines the um, point that you're trying to make. If the prestige is implicit and commands should command should compel reverence, then coming out and saying it, making it explicit in the way Collins and Lady Catherine are always doing, they undermine the prestige that they're claiming. It's prestige that demands to go unspoken, according to Burke himself. Um, so, what's interesting here is how in this passage we see precisely what it means to read between the lines, to experience a gravity of social authority by reading between the lines. So Elizabeth responds to the way in which her mother's embarrassing herself, or Collins is embarrassing himself at the ball, but she's reading between the lines, like how is Darcy reading them? How is Darcy reading her through them, through their behavior? Um, though he was not always looking at her mother, she was convinced that his attention was invariably fixed by her. The expression of his face changed gradually from indignant contempt to a composed and steady gravity. So she's feeling gravity through this complex reading of the social interaction. It's a new way of communicating and experiencing what Burke thought we should experience just in the spectacle of the trappings of aristocracy itself. Um, Elizabeth is showing us how to feel a kind of social authority through this capacity to read between the lines. Correlation of the ability to read ironically and the ability to dance is underscored remarkably complexly in a dance when Elizabeth and Darcy are talking in a dance, and they're talking about books, but they're talking about not being able to talk about books while they're dancing. Cannot talk of books in a ballroom. My head is always full of something else. And here she talks about the gravity that she is oppressed by, that she mentions before. And this also points out the problem with Darcy's pride. His She's questioning him about his stubbornness. I remember hearing you once say that you hardly ever forgave, that your resentment once created was unappeasable. Um, uh, that's there's a dogmatism that a problematic dogmatism there that she's pointing out, and that she's suffering at the same time. We see her kind of stuck. Um, I'm trying to figure you out, um, endeavoring to shake off her gravity, like she's unable to dance. And she's unable to think and read him. I'm trying to make your character out. I do not get on at all. I hear such different accounts of you as puzzle me exceedingly. Um, it's really compelling. Like her reading is being frustrated, in her, and that's evoked as a kind of sluggishness, a heaviness that doesn't dance. And um, there's something uh, self-referential here, I think, in Darcy's response. He he's mad um, at her judgment of him, um, but he's all it's a the way in which he formulates his frustration is could apply to his own behavior as well. He'd be wise to heed it. Um, he'd be wise to heed it because here he says that character is a matter of performance. It's not something you can judge once or for all. Um, when your resentment once created is unappeasable. So like he thinks he can make final judgments about others' character, um, or one's own is something that is performed. Um, so um, a kind of dance. Character is a dance-like performance, um, which is to say, interactive, socially interactive kind of performance, um, as is illustrated earlier in this chapter 18, um, in one of my favorite uh, examples of sort of a flirtation, the dance of flirtation. Um, so Lizzie's doesn't want anything to do with Darcy because he offended her, um, or what she overheard him say offended her. But Charlotte urges her. So this is interesting because Charlotte is the anti-romantic, but she's saying dance because don't be as simple. It'd be stupid not to dance for pragmatic, utilitarian, self-interested reasons, not for romantic reasons. So that's already ironic that to have Charlotte. Uh, and so Elizabeth finds herself amazed at the dignity to which she's arrived at being allowed to stand opposite Mr.'s effective performance. And this is all something that worked out in a dance like exercise. Um, and Elizabeth starts out here as the spectator, like amazed at herself being there, but she takes charge and initiates a dance of irony that's just reads really, I think, really, really modern. So just so clever, because she's reflecting on what they're supposed to be doing. Like she's reflecting on like what she's talking to Darcy as if the two of them were the characters in in a novel that as they are. So she um, uh, So really bringing the this self-awareness in the moment to life, this interaction between active bodies and minds and romantic formulas and formulas of class interaction and gender interaction. Um, they stood some time without speaking a word, and she began to imagine that their silence was to laugh through the two dances, and at first was resolved not to break it, till suddenly fancying that it would be greater punishment to her partner to oblige him to speak, she made some slight observation on the dance. He replied and was again silent. After a pause of some minutes, she addressed him a second time with, again, this disarming honesty, this making us reflect, stepping out of conventional expectations by naming them explicitly. It's your turn to say something now, Mr. Darcy. I talked about the dance, and you ought to make some sort of remark on the size of the room or the number of couples. Like, it's your move now. I'm waiting. Um, he smiled and assured her that whatever she wished him to say should be said. Very well, that reply will do for the present. So, the layers of irony are amazing. He says, okay, I'll reply however you want me to. And she's like, oh, okay, that's a sufficient non-reply reply. Perhaps by and by I may observe that private balls are much pleasanter than public ones, but now we may be silent. Do you talk by rule then while you're dancing? Sometimes one must speak a little, you know. It would be odd to be entirely silent for half an hour altogether, and yet for the advantage of some, conversation ought to be so arranged as that they have the